prisoner. Trust me. They stole my playbook. I'm going to ad-lib a little bit here. First of all, I was going to mention about the Legion. This was a huge part of his life. So I'm going to focus on a couple of things. Purpose, service, having fun. So to start off, I'm not even sure that he would be here today if it wasn't for the Legion. Because the Legion gave him a responsibility, which his whole life was based on responsibility. I mean, from what Franz mentioned early on, to coming to the US, learning the language. I mean, I never heard my father with a German accent. Some people heard it, I certainly didn't. But for someone who, okay, one person heard it. I mean, and it was amazing because I went, okay, more than one. It was amazing how Americanized he became. I mean, he loved this country, that was mentioned. Honestly, a lot of things I was going to mention were already spoken, so I'll kind of breeze through it. But coming to the US, I had some of those conversations that Corey had, because I would fly down here. And we'd have these conversations. I'd get down here 9, 10 o'clock at night. We'd start drinking. And I mean, I remember one time, it was 4 o'clock in the morning, multiple bottles of red wine later, and we'd touch on certain things about his life and just talk about politics, a bunch of things. But he was actually, and I don't know the absolute details, but he was in Germany when it got bombed in Berlin. And that was, it was pretty, I won't get into details, but it was pretty traumatic for him. He was in preschool. And that was part of him going to the southern part of Germany, what they call the Allgäu, which is the southern part of Bavaria. I think it was part of it was to get him away from, the critical areas in Germany at the time, which was 1945, I guess, 44. So all of a sudden he ends up in the Allgäu, which there were some discussions about his positions towards the Hispanics. The reality is, I reminded him at the end of his life that Germans and Mexicans, if you listen to the music, just change the language. He was actually a German Mexican, because when you listen to, I mean, you papa music or go to a Mexican flea market, the music's almost identical. They're just speaking a different language, and he actually kind of liked that. It was Christina sent us a video, or sent me a video. My dad loved music, and just, I mean, it was probably the last week of his life, and he was in the car. This is amazing, because I mean, it's something I do routinely, eating in the car. So he's got a sandwich in one hand, and he's listening to some Mexican music, I think, that you were playing, and he's actually, I mean, he's getting into it. And I thought, it was just such a wonderful memory, because he really did, he loved people, he loved music, that was a big part of who he was. So Corey was talking about education. I didn't realize it. A's, B's, C's, D's. My dad invented that. It was very simple to remember. A's were acceptable, B's were bogus, C's were castration, and D's were death. Failure was never an option with my father. That was not, that failure was not acceptable. So I mean, I dreaded going to school, because no matter how well we did, there was the one-on-one. I mean, you had that one-on-one, and it was like, you're not focused enough, you're screwing around, blah, blah, blah. And it didn't matter. If it was an A-, it should have been an A+. It just, that's how he was. But you know what? He was engaged. I'm going to get through this.
There you go.
Feeling better already. So, a funny story, one of those late night conversations. My mother, by the way, that's how much my mother's drank in her life. So they were definitely different people. That was a warm up for my dad. She told me a story one day, and I thought, wow, this is a really fascinating story. I need to mention it to my dad. And it had to do with, they were driving from New York back to Montreal, and they saw a UFO. I thought, wow, my mother is straight and honest. So I'm going, this is really kind of interesting. So I fly in, and we're having this conversation. I'm thinking, when am I going to bring this up with my father? I'm gonna wait till we've had a few drinks. So it's probably around 2:30 in the morning, and I thought, it's time to spring it on him. So I said, hey, Dad. I said, do you remember driving back from New York to Montreal and something happening? And he looks at me and he says, like something that flies with little green men in it? Don't know what you're talking about. And then he said, your mother's got a big mouth. That's the other thing he said. And I thought, wow, I mean, what a great story to tell your son. He goes, you know what, I don't need people thinking I'm a crackpot, but crackpot. But he goes, I've been in the Air Force, I know what conventional aircraft fly like, and this is not one of them. And we spoke about that for a while, and I thought that was really interesting. There were a bunch of those stories. He was, the story about the sailboat, which was really interesting. He was really good at being thrifty to make sure that he exposed us to everything possible. And the cool sailboat was one of them, because he did not smoke menthols. No. He did just long enough to get those cigarettes. I was going to mention that story. And but he was always really doing whatever it took to get us engaged. I'm actually the last generation, Corey and I, the last generation of kids that played hockey outside, because now it's all indoors. And towards the end, we had practices outdoors and games indoors in an arena. And I mean, he'd be out there, I mean, we'd be freezing. I mean, this is Quebec. And if it got really cold, they'd cancel them, but for the most part, they didn't. And we'd be on the bench crying. I mean, literally crying because our feet were freezing. And his attitude was, if you're cold, it's because.
No, working hard now.
That's right. That's exactly what it was. And in hindsight, he had, first of all, just being out in the elements, because we were working. He was just sitting there coaching us. But he had this walking stick that the top came off. Yeah, you know where I'm going with that. I always wondered why Dad took a nap at 11 o'clock in the morning when he home. Brandy. But that was pretty funny. But he was there for us. I mean, he absolutely, whatever it took. I could go on and share stories, but you've captured the essence of who he was. Oh, one more. Excuse me. I don't remember calling him Dad. I'm sure I did when I was young. I called him Ben, or Benny Boobs. He didn't call me Shaun. He had terms of endearment. Numbskull, knucklehead, numbnuts, something else. This is going to be my glass of water. We don't get to pick our parents. I told him years ago that if I could pick my parents, I would pick him again. Thank you.